Reproduction is immensely important to all species. In this video, I want to take some time to contemplate animals and why they're so dedicated to sexual reproduction. And most of them have different genders, male and female, to ensure that they have to reproduce sexually. So why is that so important? Now, the actual act of mating is not really that complicated, but pretty much everything before and after is complicated for animals. So this one contemplates before, kind of everything leading up to the act of mating and how that sets up all the pregnancy or egg laying, childcare afterward, and how different mating strategies help or hinder those efforts. Animals have dedicated themselves to the idea that they are going to reproduce sexually. Very few animals have the ability to even reproduce asexually, although we'll get into that a little bit. Now, reproduction itself, just mating, is not incredibly difficult for animals. That's the easy part. Breeding, however, is complicated. You have different genders. You have finding the right time and place. And that's a tricky bit. For humans, we can really reproduce any time of year, but most animals, that's not the case. There's usually one time a year when they reproduce. We call it the breeding season. Maybe it's called the rut, or in the case of these salmon over here, finding the same stream, it may be called spawning. In any case, it takes a lot of coordination for everybody to be in the same place at the same time and reproductively ready to go. Unlike us, a lot of animals really are not even able to reproduce outside of this special season. Well, animals are simple, right? There are boys and there are girls, and they mate, and that's it. Well, not all animals actually take this route. Worms and snails, for example, are hermaphrodites. They're actually both genders at the same time. Some fish, like these clownfish here, are that way. And most flower and flowering plants are both male and female. Even on the same exact structure, they have both male and female parts. Well, unfortunately, this seems like it would get around the problem of all that coordination I just talked about. Finding a mate, breeding season, all that sort of stuff. If you have male and female parts, just reproduce. Go for it. You don't even need to find a mate. But they still do. Here we see two worms breeding. Now, both worms are both male and female at the same time, but they exchange sperm. And this gives them more variety for their offspring. And that's really the key, right? Variety is the spice of life, and it certainly is one of the main goals of sexual reproduction and the main advantages of that. Now, these clownfish are what's known as sequential hermaphrodites. They actually start life as male and then become female. And them and about 500 species of fish, a few mollusks and crustaceans fall into this category. Some of them go the other way. They start female and then become male. But in the clownfish, they have an interesting society. And if, let's say, this is the main reproductive female, if she were to die, then this one, let's say this one's a male, would take over that role of the reproductive female and become female. Really strange, isn't that? It's strange to think of genders as that flexible, even living in sort of the awareness we have now of sort of gender roles and flexibility there. It's unusual to think of species just normally switching genders right in the middle of life. One way of getting around the complexity of breeding seasons is parthenogenesis. Fairly unusual, a little more common in invertebrates like these aphids, some roundworms, water fleas like these guys over here. And in these cases, females give birth to young without ever having mated with a male. Now, in vertebrates, it seems to be fairly rare. It's been documented in Komodo dragons and captive populations of sharks where people know they have not been around other males of the same species and yet have still given birth. One interesting example is whiptail lizards, which have fairly commonly all female populations. And they even go through kind of an act of mating. It looks like they are mating, but they're both female. That seems to stimulate egg production, um, and they then later give birth. In some cases, individuals go through the process of meiosis, and remember that creates different eggs and sperm, resulting in genetic variety in their offspring. And this seems to be the case, at least in some of those captive shark populations. And in that case, the offspring are essentially half clones to mom. In other cases, like the aphids over here, they're a bit more unusual. Uh, they do not have meiosis when the mom gives birth. Even more unusually, this female produces young without going through meiosis and gives live birth, not laying eggs like most insects do. And so these little youngsters literally pop out the back end of the female and are full clones. Now, this seems like a bad strategy in terms of variety, but aphids usually go through some sort of sexual reproduction at the beginning of the season or at the end, where they fly around, males and females find each other, fertilize, but then during the rest of the season, females go for this efficient method of producing lots and lots of offspring, which is why on your garden plants there's no aphids one day and then it's covered the next. But all this should really tell you something. The fact that parthenogenesis is rare tells you that this is not a winning strategy. It has not stood the test of time, and that really most animals have two parents, two genetic individuals to contribute and form unique offspring. Animal species, separate genders are the norm. And very often, although not always, we see this dimorphism. Remember, di means two, and morph refers to its form. And so males and females look different. We're kind of used to this, right? Even when we invent characters, you can tell which one is male and which one is female. Males are larger, they're more muscular, they're hairier than the females. They're usually more slight and less hairy. Sometimes this is fairly extreme. Most birds show quite extreme sexual dimorphism, although not always. Uh, Along with this different appearance, there are often different gender roles. A lot of times males are muscular because they are the protector. I mean, look at this silverback gorilla. Who's going to mess with that guy? I mean, he could quite literally rip your arms off. And the males are often the protectors. Females, though, have the harder role. Their job is to be the ones that reproduce. And the cost you don't always think about with genders in general and even sexual dimorphism, I guess really this goes more toward speaking to having different genders. Uh, this is a bit of a cost because only half of your population can actually reproduce. Just the females, right? What are the males there for? Some populations will even kind of swing the number of males and females a little bit differently, but usually it's about half and half. So only half your population can reproduce. But given that it's so common, there must be some advantages to it. So the next obvious question then, if we're going to have genders, how are genders determined? How do you actually get males and females? When many species, all these here on the left side, then we have special sets of chromosomes, that genetic material called sex chromosomes. And those sex chromosomes determine the gender. Let's take mammals, just a few insects, but this it covers really a lot of the familiar ones. Interestingly, female is essentially the default option. I don't mean that pejoratively, just if you don't have a Y chromosome, it's not just the two X chromosomes. If you only had one X chromosome, or two, or three, or four, or five, you would still end up as a female. What makes mammals male is actually having that Y chromosome. And so what happens is, in this case, the Y chromosome is the chromosome carrying genes. Those genes cause hormones, mainly testosterone, to be produced. Those hormones then influence hundreds of other genes in the body, and those then create differences in form and function of all the different cells in the body. That's why males and females look different. So those hormones, that testosterone, one of the things that it does is make hair, right? Men almost universally are hairier than women, and that's one of the actions of testosterone, and it carries on down the line. Now, in other species, then they have kind of the opposite system, where if you have a mix of the sex chromosomes, then you end up being female, two are the same as male. Uh, some arthropods have some interesting systems where the sex chromosome, the X chromosome, if you get two of them, you're female, but only one is male. So that covers most of the chromosomal types. What about other forms? I think one of the most interesting is ants and bees. Now, this may not seem significant, well, it's just ants and bees, but you know, I've heard it said that ants, if you put all the ants of the world on one end of a scale and all the humans on the other, they would weigh the same. So this is not trivial. I mean, these represent a lot of species, and they have a really unusual system. If you have half the normal chromosome number total, that we call that being haploid. You just have one set. If you have two full sets, then you are diploid. And in ants and bees, that makes you female. And so all the females are really what make up the entire hive or colony, and they come from fertilized eggs. Males, how do you get to be haploid? You basically come from an unfertilized egg, and that is what makes you male. So it's another genetic determining factor, but not just from sex chromosomes. Really kind of interesting. One last one to mention is in many reptile species, it's the temperature. Something not genetic at all. An environmental factor ranging from cold to hot during this critical period that determines gender. In crocodilians and lizards, if you're kind of in this intermediate range, then that tends to produce male offspring, and colder and hotter produce female. Whereas in turtles, it's the cooler temperatures that produce males and the warmer temperatures that produce females. Really kind of crazy. Very different than this genetic determination in all the other ones we've looked at. But this should also suggest something else that we won't get into really very much, other than just to mention. We have been talking about gender as though it is purely binary, male and female. And most of the time it is in most animal species. However, there's a lot of complexity here. What if that temperature is right on the borderline? What about this Y chromosome? We said that one causes you to produce hormones, and those hormones affect other genes. Well, it seems like that's a pretty complex system. There are ways that could be altered that are not purely binary. It produces hormones. How much testosterone does it produce? A lot? A little bit? It varies quite a bit. And so it's not surprising that we get some gender ambiguity in many animal species. Well, that's gender. What about breeding? How does that take place? Well, there's really a range from monogamous relationships, one partner, all the way to promiscuous, of having many partners. Probably the most common is polygamy, and we'll talk about each one of these. Let's start with monogamy. Even though it's probably the most rare, you got one male, one female, they mate. Why would you do this? And you got to ask yourself that. Why would an animal commit to just one partner? It's kind of like the question of gender. Hey, if you separate genders, now you only have half of your population able to breed. Well, usually the answer is they need help. The young are just really demanding. I mean, these osprey here, it takes months to raise each of these young. These young birds have to grow really fast and basically become full-grown adults, put on a huge amount of weight. I mean, if babies grew this fast, human babies, it would be just mind-boggling. But if it takes a lot of work to raise the young, you have to have someone stand watch. You might need two gathering food. This is often the case with birds. This strategy makes sense. The male sticks around and helps raise the young. This is actually a pretty rare case outside of birds. So birds is fairly common, although hardly the rule. There are many birds we think of as monogamous, but when genetic tests are done, we find, well, maybe there wasn't as much faithfulness as we thought. Rodents are rarely monogamous, but beavers seem to manage this. And some of that may have to do with the harsh environment they often live in, or just kind of the specialty of their pond. But that's monogamy. Not incredibly common, but a very successful strategy in these cases. Interesting note here about the osprey. They are extremely monogamous. They usually will mate for life, and they can live 20 years. And they're migratory species. So they go between the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere and back. But the pair will come back and find the same tree and build a nest there in that tree. And each year they keep adding to it and adding to it and adding to it. And over those 15 years, that nest can reach 6 feet across. Really pretty remarkable. Most species are not that monogamous. When we say monogamy, it counts if they breed with only one partner for that season. Usually the next season, it's a different partner to highly varying degrees. So you might say serial monogamy is kind of the norm there. Well, the question has also come up, what causes monogamy? I mean, I talk about it as a strategy. Is this something the species reason out? Well, we got a clue from this little tiny rodent called a vole. And there's one species, and most voles are fairly promiscuous, but it is the monogamous prairie vole. And studies showed that they had really high levels of a hormone called oxytocin. This hormone is secreted by mammals, humans included. It's produced during childbirth and breastfeeding and even sex. This hormone changes the brain a bit to promote social bonding. And it seems that that's at least part of the reason that some species are monogamous and others are not, due to higher levels of oxytocin and social bonding. When it comes to reproduction, no doubt that females bear the largest burden in terms of reproduction. Even if the male sticks around, she still has the largest energy and time input into reproduction. So wouldn't it be in her best interest to make sure that the genes that she's receiving are at least going to produce some top-notch offspring? Of course. And this is kind of the idea behind courtship rituals. Whether that's lizards flaring out their dewlap and doing push-ups, or kind of dating and courtship rituals in human beings. We do some silly stuff to prove ourselves, guys especially. I think even to a certain extent, the whole wedding ceremony may be a bit of a courtship ritual, proving that you really want to marry this person, and if you're willing to go through all that planning and choosing of cake flavors and such. Well, back to animal species. In birds, this is really common. A little less so in mammals. You might consider the fight that um, elk and deer and bighorn sheep have to be a type of courtship ritual, but that's more just fighting for the rights to the mate. The courtship ritual, a little more peaceful. This is something the male does to demonstrate to the female that he is worthy, and she can then either choose to accept him or reject him. And this can be as simple as a song. I mean, the tricolored blackbird and red-winged blackbirds have this very loud, very elaborate song, and they have to learn that song. That's actually part of the ritual. Not only does it show that he's the right species, and that's part of this, is he fit? Does he have good genes to pass on? But is he the right species? May seem like a strange sort of criterion to put in there, but it's not always easy for others to tell. Just make sure that we get things right. We're not just two closely related species and are not going to produce actual viable offspring. So males have to learn the right call. They have to be good at it, or they're never going to attract a mate. Very often, male birds are showy as well, whether it's just these red and yellow wing bars or if they're a solid, bright, vivid color. A lot of biologists think that those bright colors you see in birds are a way of saying, look, not only am I kind of studly enough to be bright and showy and produce these colors, but I have survived for months or years with essentially a target painted on my back. I mean, every predator can see me, but I've survived, and here I am to court you. Um, Other times it's more of a show. Cooper's hawks put on an interesting show. In a lot of raptors, the male is actually smaller than the female, so he's very careful around her. And he will bring her food as part of the courtship ritual and often do certain flights. He does a lot of the nest building. And so there's quite a bit of real practical stuff. Look, I'm going to be a good provider. Kind of back to the human courtship ritual. Here's a ring showing that I have the ability to provide for you. Will you marry me? In a real extreme case of the greater sage grouse and several other grouse, the male puts on a show. And in this case, they do this, all the males at once, in this performance called a lek, where all the males dance and strut around and make weird noises, and the females just sit out as an audience and watch these males be absolutely ridiculous. And then the females choose, and they wander off with the male of their choosing. So that's how they do that. And these males sometimes will just wear themselves out. They'll go without food for days on end and just be almost exhausted by the entire thing and take quite a long time to recover. Albatross, kind of interesting because they're monogamous and they will find each other after a year at sea and come back and go through this ritual of essentially showing their identity, knowing the dance. And they will do this together. They'll spread their wings, they'll stomp around, they'll clack their beaks. And if they don't do it just right, kind of like a secret handshake, then that indicates you're not my mate. So we go through a lot of rituals. And again, the reason for this is the female, she's going to put a lot of time and energy and make herself vulnerable to produce offspring. She wants to make sure that she's getting a good deal. So, like I said at the beginning, you know, uh, breeding is complicated. Mating itself, maybe not as much, but the whole breeding ritual, finding each other, courting one another, raising the offspring, that's one of the more complicated and risky things that most animals do during their lifetime.